Growing up in the 90s, I naturally have a bit of an affinity for Spawn. For those who have come to comics after the 90s, it might seem a little difficult to understand what all the fuss is about, but way back then, Spawn was a really big deal. It was the first major success for Image Comics, and of course that represented a whole seismic shift in the way comics were being produced and made at that time. And Spawn was the first properly creator-owned property of Todd McFarlane, and it was a massive success, and Todd was really able to explore his art and do whatever he wanted to do with comic books during this time. And I can't overstate just how significant Todd McFarlane was back in the 90s. He was the superstar of superstar artists, along with Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld. But despite the initial success of Spawn, Todd would eventually move his attention away from drawing the comic book and would stay on as a writer for a long time, but he would ultimately start to turn his attention to other industries, most famously of course McFarlane Toys. And of course the first toys that were produced under this toy company was of course Spawn characters. Now, that being said, McFarlane Toys have definitely diversified across the years, taking in all sorts of different properties and licenses, and if anything, I feel like their attention has definitely waned when it comes to Spawn. However, in recent years, McFarlane has definitely seemed to renew interest in the Spawn brand, and I'm really pleased to say we're starting to see some classic Spawn characters being made in the 7-inch scale with some hyper articulation. And today I'm going to take a look at the Redeemer. Now, this is definitely a character who made his debut in the early part of Spawn's comic book run, but at the time his earliest appearances definitely had more of a black costume rather than this very bright blue one. However, I do think that works very well in this figure's favour, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we progress. But as ever, let's start off by looking at the packaging. Now, the box is slightly oversized. It's not huge, but it is a little bit bigger than, say, your standard DC release from McFarlane Toys. And whilst the figure himself isn't much bigger than those figures, there is one crucial difference, of course, and that this is a warrior angel for all intents and purposes, so he does have those huge wings, and the box needs to accommodate them. But as you can see, the front of this packaging is largely just a window display. There's not an awful lot going on here. We have this Spawn logo in the bottom left hand corner there, and then we have this green background to really emphasise the figure inside. Overall, it's fairly attractive, but it's a little bit dull, but it's all about the figure here. However, I do really like this side panel. Here we have some proper artwork from the comic books. Now, this doesn't look to me to be Todd McFarlane art, but nevertheless it is direct from source, which is very attractive, always looks good on the shelf, and is very presentable. And then finally we have the reverse of the packaging, and it is fairly simplistic. It is essentially just a promo photo of the figure in action, but it looks very nice. And I do like the extra touch of having that light beam, sort of like a ray from the heavens coming down, and the figure is definitely consistent. And in the background there we can see the image of Spawn's face in sort of greyed out there. So all in all, not a lot going on here, certainly very light on text, but it is very presentable and it looks very good on display. So once you liberate the figure from his packaging and you plug in his wings, this is quite an impressive figure, mainly because he does have that fairly huge wingspan, which makes his figure quite broad and definitely quite overbearing on the shelf. Now, there's not a great deal of paint apps on this figure. What we do have this very vibrant bright blue, which is very attractive and colourful. I like that. And then we have this quite rich gold plastic as well, which is quite nicely done. It's definitely nicely painted on the head sculpt there. But one thing I did notice is these plastic shoulder pads look a little bit cheap. They're a little bit disconnected from the actual shoulder on the figure there, and they don't quite mesh together nicely. There's definitely a sense that those shoulder pads are just very stuck on, and they feel stuck on. They don't feel organic to this costume. And I have to say, I think the sculpting on this figure is absolutely fine. There's nothing I would really change here. I might change some of the elements, so rather than have that sort of cheaper plastic or rubber, I would definitely firm it up and make it feel a bit more rich, a bit more solid. But honestly, my biggest gripe with this figure really is the lack of detail, the lack of paint apps running through this figure. There's no real washes to this. There's some nice sculpting, but they haven't really done anything with it. All those grooves and details and fine pieces, there's no wash over to really accentuate them and make them stand out, and generally just give the figure more of a textured feel to it. Now, you might argue that that is an artistic choice that is deliberately done that way, but I tend to feel that actually they've saved this level of detail for the wings, because when we look at the wings, there's a lot going on here. Fantastic sculpt, really lovely mold. You get the sense that each of these feathers is actually unique. I think they've done a really nice job, and the reason it stands out so well and it looks so good is because they've actually applied those extra paint apps, those extra washes running through them. So we have white and greys and blacks running through here. That just makes them look textured, makes it look more authentic and more like real life. And I do think it's a little bit odd because it stands in such high contrast to the rest of this figure, which is quite simple in terms of its paint apps everywhere else. So we have a very simple figure, but with these really elaborate, really ornate wings. Now, it definitely elevates this figure, and I think that by far and away the best part of this figure. It really looks fantastic. But I just wish they'd applied the same level of care and detailing to the rest of the figure. So then, let's take a look at the articulation. Well, he does have a ball joint in the head. This seems a little bit stiff, like it doesn't seem to quite want to move around. Now it can do, you can get it to spin a full 360 degrees, but there is certainly a little bit of resistance in it for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. There is a bit of an ability to nod his head up and down, but not a huge range of motion here. He does have ball jointed shoulders though, and as you can see they can really flip up high, and mercifully, because the shoulder pads are a soft plastic, they do move with this articulation rather than hinder it, so that is really very good. Now, he's also got an upper bicep swivel, he's got double jointed elbow, and he also has a pin swivel at the wrist as well. So of course he can spin that wrist 360 degrees, and he can hinge it forwards and backwards, although again there's a little bit of unnecessary resistance, it feels, to being able to get the most out of this, and certainly the back of the gauntlet, the back of the hand, seems to have more issues flipping back than going forwards. Now, he's also got articulation in his upper chest. There is a ball joint in his chest that allows him to hinge from side to side and move forwards and backwards. This is very stiff. There's a much better, much more significant ball joint in his actual waist, which is fantastic because it really allows him to rotate all the way around and bend forwards and backwards as well. He's also got a ball joint that is very nicely concealed within his hips, so he can kick his legs out to the side, and of course they kick forwards and backwards as well. And this is then complemented with a double joint at the knee as well, so he can kick his legs a really good distance back there, and it looks pretty good all in all. And then finally we have a ball joint in the ankle as well, so the foot can hinge forwards and backwards, and it can slide from side to side as well on that swivel there. But it's also supported by a toe articulation as well, just a hinge there, so you can get maximum articulation out of the feet on this figure. But we also have some added articulation in the wings because they slot into the figure on these sorts of pin swivels, and they can hinge inwards and outwards, and they can lift up and down, so plenty of options to get the most out of our wings here and get some really dynamic poses going. Now, he is fairly light on accessories. He comes with just one extra, and that is his giant sword, of course. Now, this is very nicely sculpted, but again, they haven't made the most of this. They haven't capitalised on this sculpt by giving it a nice paint wash, so it does look all one shade really, and it is quite plastic looking. But he does hold it very well. There's no issues getting this into his grip. It's nice and tight. There's no danger of it sliding out or having any issues holding it. And it looks quite impressive when it's in his hand because it is so tall and it looks pretty majestic all in all. Now, for the sake of a scale comparison, I have put him next to the recent Spawn release, which is from the Mortal Kombat line from McFarlane Toys, but for all intents and purposes, this is in the correct 7-inch scale, and these look pretty good together. Now, we can see the world of difference between these two figures, though, when it comes to the detailing and the paint tabs. If we look at this Spawn release, we can see so much more texture and much more detail when it comes to the paint tabs, which really brings out the sculpt, and obviously this figure is a lot darker, and it just feels a lot more authentic and a lot more textured than what we see with the Redeemer figure, who's a lot brighter, which is definitely not a criticism, but when it comes to the detailing on the costume, it just looks a lot more toyetic and less like these figures belong together. But that said, thematically, I think that kind of works because, of course, they are meant to represent different sides of the coin, the dark and the light, so actually, that probably is in the figure's favour, and I do really like that the Redeemer has a little bit of extra height to the Spawn figure. He just manages to tower over him a little bit more, and with those wings, he seems like a proper, legitimate threat to Spawn, and I think this is set up very nicely in terms of how these figures scale together. This looks really solid. So then, final thoughts. I think for me this figure is probably going to be a 3-star. I really like this figure. I think they've done a tremendous job of it. I love the scaling. I love that he comes with those fantastic wings. I think they're so wonderfully painted that it looks really, really good. But I still can't get over that slight nagging feeling that this figure could be definitely enhanced with a different paint wash and a little bit more texture to it. It would really enhance the sculpted there. As it is, it just feels a little bit bland. It feels like it's just a little bit too plastic feeling. It feels a little bit cheaper than really it should, and it's a shame because I think there's a basis of a really fantastic figure here that's just kind of a little bit just missing that little bit extra that would have just pushed it over the edge. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.